Good afternoon or good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. I'm your host, Kiana Canada. Welcome back to Kiana's show. I'm recording on my phone instead of my camera because there is limited space on my SD cards. I have been doing a new series called The Public Square, and I will link that series in the description box below. So I plan to create a playlist, but you can go on my YouTube channel at Real Kiana Canada. That is my YouTube channel at Real Kiana Canada. It's important to understand that I only have two social media accounts, which is Facebook as well as YouTube. So this Facebook account is Kiana Canada, and then my YouTube account is at Real Kiana Canada. I do have a Substack, but as you know, I am actually locked out of that account, so I don't have access to it. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk about this evening an activist that made the news. Now, my voice is hoarse because I tried to record this video several times over, and so I'm extremely hoarse, and I don't know if I'm coming down with a cold or something, but my voice is so hoarse. But there was an activist that made the news, and his name is Guido Reichstadter. And he scaled the Frederick Douglass Bridge, and that got me thinking about the spectacle, right? And it wasn't not necessarily the fact that there was a man on top of the Frederick Douglass Bridge, or that a man was advocating for particular political issues. It was just the spectacle of a person taking action, and myself as a spectator watching that, right? And so Guido, this was not his first time scaling the Frederick Douglass Bridge. He scaled the bridge before in protest against, I believe, the Supreme Court's decision on Roe versus Wade, which had to do with abortion rights. And he disagreed with that decision and took to the bridge. He took to the bridge and protested that ruling. Well, last week, what he did was he protested, or currently he's protesting, and I'm not really sure if he's still on the bridge. The last time I checked was this morning, and he posted a tweet and a video to his X account, which stated that he was likely going to come down from the bridge because that he didn't have enough water, and he also stated he was going to come down from the bridge because I think he was getting tired of being up there. He made clear, and I think most of us knew this, but he said that, or not necessarily that he made clear, but he admitted that he would likely go to jail for being on that bridge. And that got me thinking. It got me thinking as to the kind of activism that activists engage in that could possibly land them in jail, essentially. And I wanted to know, why do activists engage in specific types of activism that could incarcerate them? We know that Guido is not the only activist that was arrested for engaging in a political act, right? Some would call an extreme political act or extreme act of protest, but then others would disagree. Others would say, hey, Kiana, there's other protests that are more extreme than what Guido engaged in. And I would agree. And we'll get into that later. But there is a woman named Therese Patricia Okoumou, who actually scaled the Statue of Liberty in 2018. And she was protesting the treatment of immigrants in detention centers. And of course, this was under the Trump administration. In 2016, she protested Donald Trump's election, and she did this for hours by herself. And this protesting Donald Trump and his election, doing it by herself, was, I think, done even before it was in vogue. It was done before it was in vogue. And so it was interesting that we have all these persons that are engaging in these acts of protest. And they are protesting what some would refer to as extreme acts of protest, scaling a monument, scaling the Frederick Douglass Bridge, scaling the Statue of Liberty, right? And going back to Guido, we know that Guido did have a list of demands. And his first demand was, 1, to end the war in Iran, 2, to remove the Trump regime from power, and to compel an end to the extinction from artificial intelligence. And some would argue that those are quite broad demands. Others would argue that the demands are well suited and sufficiently accurate to compel governments to act. But I do have questions about these demands. And I want to make clear that I take no position one way or the other. I am speaking about this from the perspective of a human rights defender, but more so an academic or a person who is interested in academia. I'm not a professor. I'm not an educator, but I am interested in sociology, psychology, law. I'm interested in, of course, anthropology, and interested in political protest. And so the questions that I have is that, how can Guido be sure the government will comply with his demands? That's a question that I have, and I'm not really sure that he considered this fully. I'm not really sure that he considered it or that he cogitated on it, but how can he be sure that the government will comply with his demands? And I don't think that that he elaborated on this very much when he decided to scale the Frederick Douglass Bridge. Now, I do understand that these political issues are emotional. I have engaged in multiple political issues in my life, and it is quite an emotional feat. But as I continue to study protest and to look at them as a spectator rather than a person that is engaging in the protest myself, I can't help but to ask these questions, because I think that these questions are important for any person who is engaging in these actions and seeks to create or to make change. Another question that I had is, in what way did Guido ensure the government will bind itself to this contract that he created? Now, keep in mind, I am a socialist. I am not a person who has any conservative values. My values are more so liberal and socialist. But I think, ladies and gentlemen, when we are considering this in its totality and considering this fully, I think these are important questions that one would ask, or one would need to ask. Other questions that I have is, well, who accepts and carries out the demands? So, of course, Guido had a list of demands, but who is going to accept his demands, and who's going to carry it out? Say, for instance, the government did decide that they were going to end the war in Iran, or remove the Trump regime from office or from power, or compel an end to the extinction from artificial intelligence. Well, who is going to carry out those demands? And I think what Guido did was he put several issues or several demands into one singular protest. And I think that this would have been better if it was dispersed into other protests. So, for example, I know that these are all issues that are important to him, as they are important to everyone else. But let's say, for instance, if he said, okay, right now I am going to protest compelling in to human extinction from artificial intelligence, right? I think that, yes, this would be a protest that is focused on probably tech billionaires, right? Silicon Valley. But then it would also be a protest for maybe the US government and politicians to listen to that as well. And other questions that I had was, well, when should Guido's demands be carried out? And are those demands negotiable? Are they non-negotiable? Are they negotiable? Is there any room to wiggle? Okay, let's say, for instance, in the war in Iran, well, what are the steps to doing that, and how to do that efficiently would be the question. And what would it take to do that? Politically, diplomatically? What would it take to do that non-violently? Of course, Guido has specified that he is a non-violent activist. So what would it take to do this? And where should the negotiations take place? Of course, these negotiations cannot take place on the Frederick Douglass Bridge, on top of the Frederick Douglass Bridge. They can't take place there. And we know that they wouldn't be able to take place while he's incarcerated, because he loses a lot of leverage once incarcerated. The government has all of the leverage. So where does the negotiations take place? And it goes back to my original thought as to whether this was thought out, whether there was enough brainstorming on this and whether or not the people around him that perhaps encouraged him thought about how this would go. Now, I don't know if anyone did encourage him. He definitely did not allude to that in his posts that I've seen, but he may have done this by himself. But at any rate, like, it has me thinking, like, was there enough brainstorming behind this act that he engaged in? Another thing that got me thinking is whether or not society would argue that this is an extreme act of protest. Now, others would disagree. Others would say, well, this is moderate compared to some of the most extreme acts of protest, like, Aaron Bushnell, who, engaged in an act of self-immolation on December 1st, 2023. And then there was Matt Nelson, who engaged in the same act of self-immolation in 2024, and Samuel Mina later that year, howsoever survived. I think people would argue that those are extreme acts of protest. Howsoever, when we look at Guido, people would say, well, no, it does not compare to that. This would be a moderate level of protest, right? And I think that I would agree with that. I think that in compared to those acts of self-immolation, that scaling a bridge would be considered moderate to that. So while we're engaging in the diegesis of Guido, I do want to pivot to the non-diegetic sound of the protesters. I mean, as you know, there were protesters that did appear and showed up to the bridge while Guido was on top, but it was a small amount. And I don't know if that was because there was just protesters were exhausted about coming out so consistently, or if this hadn't garnered enough attention, or if people felt as if this was not the event of the month or the century, or I'm not sure. But there was a small number of people that did come out to protest, either in support of Guido or in support of the demands that he was making. And I have to be honest that I don't know how to feel about, not saying that I have a negative or a positive feeling about that. I'm not really sure how to feel about the fact that there was minimal protest to this moderate act on the Frederick Douglass Bridge, right? But let's take this to, or let's build on what Guido is doing from cinema studies. So I think what Guido is doing is he's drawing attention to himself as a star. I think that there's room to argue that by scaling a bridge, getting media attention, and speaking about these political issues, there is room to argue that he is drawing attention to himself as a star. This is not negative or positive. This is just observation as a spectator. But is he pointing to his authenticity as a star persona, or is it something else? And I think in this case, it would be something else, right? Because he's pointing to these particular issues that he disagrees with, while simultaneously drawing attention to himself as a star. He's saying that he doesn't like A, he doesn't like B, he wishes A, he wishes B would change, he wishes the government wouldn't do this or the government wouldn't do that, right? And so essentially he's drawing attention to himself as a star who is actively protesting these very controversial political issues and these international human rights law, humanitarian law issues as well. Now, scholars argue by being more in a moment of excess, the star proves he can impersonate a role, the hero, and yet be more of a star than one who merely personifies the role. Let me read that again. By being more in a moment of excess, the star proves he can impersonate a role, in this case, the hero, and yet be more of a star than one who merely personifies the role. So, in what some would call an extreme act of protest, excess, right? Guido would do more than personify this role that he is a star. No, he is, I guess in his mind, and I'm not sure if he thinks this, but others would seem to argue that maybe he is a hero for scaling the Frederick Douglass Bridge and advocating against these kinds of issues. But then if we let's look at it differently, right? Okay, well, if he does not consider himself as a star or even personifying the role of a star, if he does not consider himself a hero, and maybe others don't consider Guido to be a hero, then is it the star as deviant? Some would argue, maybe perhaps the government would argue that, right? Because he scaled the bridge that is unlawful or illegal, and he admits once he comes down, he would be arrested. So is the star deviant? Is a question that I want you to consider. That does not mean he is deviant, but as a spectator, are others viewing Guido, the star, as deviant is the question. Remember, we talked about excess, and so the construction of the star is most certainly about excess, in which this is ascribed to him. So Guido scaled the Frederick Douglass Bridge. This was the second time he did so. And with Therese Patricia Okoumou, she scaled, of course, the Statue of Liberty, and then she scaled the Eiffel Tower because of its connection to the Statue of Liberty. Some would say this is the star as deviant. Scaling a monument, or scaling a statue, or scaling a bridge, and that very act is illegal. Some would say the star is deviant. And I want to go into deeper about excess. So excess is mirrored in the star's lifestyle. And excess, let's focus on that. Excess is mirrored in the star's lifestyle. Now, I don't know Guido and I don't know his lifestyle, right? And so there's not enough to argue for me that there is excess in that person's life. I mean, I think we've all, at one point in time, have had excess in our life, right? But I want you to look at his protest. So look at that protest, and then look at the protests of the pro-Palestinian protesters in the UK, the ones that stormed the Elbit system, and regrettably, there was a woman who was assaulted, a steward that was assaulted during that act of protest. So we have these different levels of protest, right? We have this scaling a building, or excuse me, scaling a bridge, which I think most would agree that would not hurt any person, but could be seen as excessive and quite deviant. And then in this particular situation with the pro-Palestinian protesters storming into the Elbit system, they would consider that to be excessive as well and quite deviant, especially the person who sledgehammered the steward. And then we have, of course, these extreme acts of protest that Aaron Bushnell, Matt Nelson, and Samuel Mina engaged in, which was self-immolation, which was, I think, the most extreme forms of protest. And I think that people would argue that that is deviant, but then others would disagree. Others would say, well, no, this is what heroes do. Or this is a person personifying the role of a hero, right? And this just got me thinking. I find this quite interesting. What do you think about this? Do you think that any of these acts of protest that I named, do you think that they're moderate? Do you think that they're extreme? Do you think that Guido's demands will be met? Do you think that they will be ignored? I think I'm going to follow up with this. I'll do more research on this, but I did just a little bit of research on this topic and wanted to give commentary on it, and I will, I think, discuss it further. Right now, of course, I have a sore throat, so it's difficult for me to speak right now, but hopefully when my throat is better, we can go a little bit deeper into this topic. And ladies and gentlemen, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my Facebook. Also, subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'll be uploading this video on YouTube soon. And don't forget to follow me on Facebook. Right now, I have a channel, and, or excuse me, my Facebook account has 1 follower. I've had this account for a couple of years, and it only has 1 follower. And we know that is all the works of transnational repression. This has to do with transnational repression. And we know that this is the Irish in the United States, the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland, the United States. They're intel agencies that are keeping my followership at one person. So I hope that you do decide to follow me if you see this live stream, and I will do my best to get it up on my YouTube channel soon, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.